Gary Goodridge didn't just fight, he demolished. A 260-pound striker with a steel jaw and fists that sounded like thunder, he made his mark in the early, lawless days of MMA, when rules were few and the consequences were brutal. He went toe-to-toe with legends, headlined in Pride, and delivered knockouts that went viral before YouTube even existed. But every war came with a price. Today, Goodridge is a shell of that warrior. Diagnosed with dementia pugilistica, his memory is fading, his days are slower, the lights dimmer. He can't remember half his career. And the fans who once screamed his name have mostly moved on. This is the haunting cost of being one of the sport's early gladiator, and what happens when the brain can't keep up with the body's legacy. Before he was a cautionary tale, Gary Big Daddy Goodridge was a nightmare in human form. 260 pounds of raw power, granite fists, and a smile that masked the storm underneath. Born in Trinidad and raised in Canada, Gary didn't grow up planning to be a cage fighter. His earliest passion wasn't violence, it was arm wrestling. And not just any arm wrestling. Goodridge was a world champion, with hands like bricks and a presence that made opponents hesitate before even gripping up. But the world of arm wrestling didn't pay the bills. And in the mid-1990s, a new sport was exploding. No rules, no weight classes, just chaos. The UFC. They called him up just days before UFC 8. He said yes immediately. No real training, no game plan. Just one promise to himself: don't back down. And he didn't. In his debut, he shocked the world. Facing Paul Herrera, a skilled wrestler, Gary locked him in a crucifix and delivered a flurry of elbow strikes so brutal, so cold-blooded, that the audience went silent before erupting in horror. 10 savage elbows to the skull. Paul never saw it coming. The moment was replayed for years. Highlight reels, news shows, late-night TV. Gary Goodridge had arrived, not just as a fighter, but as a weapon. People started calling him Big Daddy, not because he was soft, but because of how he moved, like someone in complete control. But what they didn't realize was how little he actually trained. He was raw, improvising, and relied almost entirely on instincts and power. That made him dangerous, but it also made him vulnerable. He didn't know what he didn't know. He took fights on short notice. He traveled across countries for tournaments with no preparation. And as MMA evolved, the competition got sharper, more technical, more violent. But Gary didn't evolve with it. He just kept swinging, kept fighting, and kept taking damage. In a sport that rewarded toughness and punished hesitation, Gary was a promoter's dream. But that dream came with nightmares. Early concussions, headaches, blurry vision. He brushed it off. "I'm just tired," he told himself. "Just need more sleep." But the signs were already there. The rise of Big Daddy wasn't just about power, it was about sacrifice. Every punch he threw came with a price, and every punch he took was a step closer to a future no one warned him about. After his early run in the UFC, Gary Goodridge made a career move that would define and later destroy him: Pride Fighting Championships. If UFC was a wild brawl, Pride was a symphony of violence. No gloves, no weight limits, no mercy. And Japan adored Gary. He was the perfect attraction, an explosive powerhouse with charisma, showmanship, and a willingness to fight anyone, anytime. In Japan, Gary became larger than life. He walked into the Tokyo Dome in front of 50,000 fans, head held high, wearing sunglasses, robes, and pride. He wasn't just fighting anymore, he was performing, and fans loved him for it. But behind the scenes, he was being fed to lions. In Pride, Gary faced Fedor Emelianenko. He faced Igor Vovchanchin. He fought Don Fry in one of the most savage toe-to-toe wars ever filmed. He took on rising legends like Mirko Cro Cop, and every time he took a beating. It wasn't just the knockouts, it was the rounds of punishment, the leg kicks, the headshots, the ground and pound. In Japan, he'd get knocked out in one fight and be booked for another just weeks later. Medical suspensions? Non-existent. Concussion protocols? There weren't any. Gary would sometimes forget how he got to the venue. Trainers would tell him to walk it off. He believed he was indestructible. He believed pain was normal, but his brain was swelling, slowly, silently. Pride paid well, But it wasn't just about money. Gary loved the respect. In Japan, he was a hero. Kids asked for autographs. Companies offered endorsement deals. He was on TV, on billboards, in commercials. But with fame came expectation. When a promoter said fight, you fought. No question, no excuses. Gary said yes, even when he couldn't remember saying no. One day, after a fight in Saitama, Gary sat backstage with blood still running down his face. He couldn't remember who he fought. Who was it? He asked. The team thought he was joking. He wasn't. His losses piled up, and so did the trauma. But Gary's reputation was that of a warrior. He was celebrated for his bravery, while his body quietly fell apart. Every applause masked a warning sign. Every standing ovation drowned out the ringing in his ears. Pride made him a legend, but it also broke him. By the early 2000s, Gary had fought in over 40 pro bouts, and his mind was already slipping. By the time most fighters start winding down, Gary Goodridge was still saying yes to anyone with a check. It didn't matter how short the notice was. It didn't matter if his last fight ended in a stretcher. He had become the embodiment of what MMA glorified in its early years: toughness at all costs. But behind the scenes, the cracks in the armor were starting to show. Gary was forgetting things, important things, names, dates. He'd misplace his phone and not remember he even had one. Friends noticed he was repeating himself, sometimes telling the same story 3 times in an hour. At first, he laughed it off. "I've always been forgetful," he'd say. But deep down, he was starting to worry. The symptoms worsened. He'd lose his train of thought mid-sentence. He'd walk into a room and forget why he was there. His once explosive energy dulled. He became quieter, less confident, less present. For a man who had once electrified stadiums with his entrances, the silence in his mind became deafening. Doctors were dismissive. "You're just tired, probably stress, maybe depression." Nobody wanted to say it. CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the degenerative brain disease affecting athletes in high-impact sports. But Gary knew. He'd seen it happen to others: boxers, wrestlers, even old MMA friends. And now he was next. What made it worse was the lack of help. There was no union, no pension, no retirement fund. MMA was still the Wild West. Fighters were on their own. Gary had no saving, no safety net, and every symptom he experienced came with a terrifying question. What if this gets worse? He kept fighting. Not in cages anymore, but in life, filing for disability, trying to hold down appearances, smiling through interviews where the questions blurred together. He wanted to be strong, but strength wasn't enough now. He needed help, and there was none. In the sport, where he gave everything, his hands, his face, his memories, Gary Goodridge was now alone, forgotten. And that silence? It was louder than any crowd he'd ever fought in front of. It wasn't until 2012 that Gary finally got an answer. After years of mounting symptoms, forgotten moments, and emotional breakdowns, he visited a neurologist in Canada. The tests were quiet but conclusive. The verdict? Early onset dementia, likely caused by chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE. The diagnosis didn't come with a roadmap or cure, just a chilling confirmation of what he already feared. His brain was breaking down piece by piece. At first, Gary rejected it. "Nah, I'm just tired. I've been through worse." But denial is a luxury time doesn't afford. The memory gaps grew wider. He forgot names of people he loved. He'd start a conversation and drift into silence, unable to remember where he was going with it. One day, he looked in the mirror and didn't recognize himself. That's when it hit. This wasn't just wear and tear from a rough career. This was the permanent erosion of who he was. He tried to speak out. In interviews, he warned younger fighters, "This sport can kill you, slowly." But most didn't want to hear it. MMA was growing, becoming polished, sanitized, commercialized. Gary's warnings were inconvenient. He wasn't marketable anymore. No promotion was calling. No fans were tweeting about him. The new wave didn't even know who he was. Worse, the industry he helped build turned away. No support from big organizations, no acknowledgement from the UFC, no alumni program, nothing, just radio silence. "You feel like a disposable weapon," he said. "They use you when you're hot, then throw you away when you're broken." And he was broken, mentally, emotionally, and financially. His daily routine became a battle. Pills for memory, alarms for appointments, notes on the wall to remind him when to eat. His once massive frame, the same one that sent shockwaves through opponents, had started to shrink. The power was fading, but the spirit, still flickering, still trying. Some days were good, others not so much. He'd cry without knowing why. He'd forget how to get home. And worst of all, he knew what was coming. CTE isn't just tragic, it's cruel, because the victim often knows exactly what they're losing as they're losing it. And Gary, he was fully aware. He wasn't just fighting dementia, he was racing it. Gary Goodridge's story should have been one of honor, a pioneer, a gladiator, a man who stood toe-to-toe with legends and never backed down. But instead, his name became a footnote, an uncomfortable reminder of MMA's brutal beginnings. And that's what hurt the most. Not the blows, not even the diagnosis, but the silence. No tribute, no UFC Hall of Fame, no acknowledgement of the wars he fought so others could thrive in a safer, more lucrative version of the sport. It was as if his legacy had been swallowed by time. When younger fans talked about pioneers, they mentioned Royce Gracie, Ken Shamrock, maybe Don Fry. Gary's name was left off the list. He tried to stay involved. He gave speeches. He coached when he could. But promoters were hesitant. Sponsors ghosted him. The same people who once celebrated his violence now avoided his vulnerability. Dementia made him unpredictable. He'd lose track of thoughts mid-interview. He couldn't hold down long conversation. And so, opportunities dried up. He was on his own, just like he had been in the ring all those years. Except now, the opponent wasn't wearing gloves. It was a slow, invisible decay. To make matters worse, medical bills piled up. Specialized care isn't cheap. Therapy, tests, memory support. His disability claim took years. Donations trickled in from loyal fans, but not enough to change his life. He wasn't living, he was surviving. And yet, through it all, Gary stayed generous. He'd answer DMS. He'd call aspiring fighters and tell them to be smart. "Learn from me," he'd say. "Don't be me." But those words fell like whispers in an industry too busy cashing pay-per-view checks. The UFC never reached out. Pride was long gone. He was a relic, admired by some, forgotten by most. A museum piece that no one bothered to dust off. And in his darkest moments, Gary began to wonder, was it worth it? Was the fame, the applause, the short bursts of glory, worth the decades of pain that followed? Gary Goodridge isn't just fighting dementia, he's fighting to stay himself. And that battle plays out every single day in the smallest ways. A forgotten birthday, a misplaced remote, a sentence that starts and never ends. To the outside world, it might seem minor, but to Gary, it's like pieces of his identity are crumbling in real time. His family sees it. His daughter has spoken about watching her father change, slowly. The man who once lit up rooms now sometimes stares blankly at the wall, trying to remember where he is. Friends from the fighting days check in less often. Some say it's because they can't bear to see what he's become. Others just moved on. And for Gary, moving on isn't an option. He's stuck in a loop, trapped in a body that looks familiar, with a mind that no longer plays by the same rules. There are days when he can recall a fight from 1996 in vivid detail, and then there are days when he can't remember his own address. Still, he finds small victories. He journals, even if he has to reread the same entries. He takes walks when he can. He listens to music, clinging to melodies that stir old emotions. He smiles when fans send messages. "You're the reason I got into MMA," they write. And for a moment, the fog clears. But the tragedy of Gary Goodridge isn't just what happened to him. It's how preventable some of it was. How different his life might have been with better medical care, industry support, or just someone telling him to stop when he'd already given too much. Instead, he kept going. Because that's what warriors do. They don't quit, they don't complain, but they also don't last forever. Gary's body may still be here, but the man inside is slowly disappearing. And unless someone tells his story, unless the world sees the cost of the punches they cheered for, it might all be forgotten, just like he feared. There's a cruel irony in Gary's condition. While his memory fades, his body still remembers. Old injuries resurface, nerve damage flares, and his sleep is broken by sudden bursts of panic, like he's trapped in a fight that never ends. What's worse, some of the most iconic moments of his career he doesn't remember at all. Ask him about his legendary debut at UFC 8, where he shocked the world with a brutal elbow knockout, and he'll pause. The image is vague, the memory distant, but ask him about how his head feels waking up in the morning, and the pain is immediate. It's sharp, real, constant. That's the paradox of brain trauma. It robs you of the joy, but leaves you with the agony. And while his brain slips further into darkness, the footage lives on YouTube, on highlight reel, on MMA documentaries praising the golden era of violence. People still watch his knockouts in awe. Commentators still use his name when describing grit. But Gary? He's often watching himself like a stranger. "I don't remember doing that," he once said during a replay of his Pride fight, "but I can feel it in my bones." Even more tragic, he sacrificed his health for fights that, back then, paid barely enough to cover medical bills. He fought for pride, for opportunity, for the promise of something greater down the line. But that promise never came. Fighters today earn millions per event. Gary was lucky if he walked away with 5 figures and no insurance. So what remains? Just clips, replays, and scattered fragments in his mind that flicker like old film, some faded, some warped, all of them fragile. And behind those memories is a man trying to put together a past that's slipping through his fingers faster than he can hold onto it. He's become a ghost in his own story, immortalized on screens, but slowly disappearing in real life. Gary Goodridge never wanted to be a cautionary tale, but now that's the role he's embraced. If his suffering means one young fighter walks away sooner, he says it will all be worth it. He's spoken at gyms, he's done interviews, he's stared into the camera and said the words that promoters hate hearing. "This sport will kill you if you're not careful." It's not just about the knockouts, it's about the lifestyle, the grind, the mindset that says, one more fight, just one more payday. Gary knows that logic. It nearly destroyed him. "They'll cheer for you when you bleed," he says, "but they won't remember when you're gone." And yet, most young fighters brush off the warnings. "It won't happen to me. Science is better now." But Gary has heard that before. Back in Pride, fighters used to laugh off concussions. In the UFC, they were told to shake it off. And in those days, standing tall and not complaining was seen as toughness. Now, he sees it for what it was: ignorance. Still, he keeps speaking, because the damage is done to him, but maybe it doesn't have to be for the next guy. He's even tried to work with MMA commissions, pushing for better post-career care, but the red tape is thick, the interest is low. Gary doesn't have sponsors behind him, no lobbyists, just his voice, and it's getting quieter every year. Some organizations have thanked him, a few journalists have told his story, but the system that allowed him to be hurt, it hasn't changed much. Fighters are still underpaid, head trauma is still a mystery, and retirement often means silence, not celebration. So Gary fights in a different way now, not in a ring, but with truth, honesty, painful confessions. He shares his story, not for sympathy, but for impact. He knows time is short, his memory is slipping, but his mission is clear: be the warning he never got. Because if someone had warned him, really warned him, he might still be whole today. Legacy, it's a word thrown around in sports all the time. But for Gary Goodridge, it doesn't mean belts or trophies. It means being remembered, being seen, being valued not just for what he did, but for what he gave up to do it. He never had a retirement fight, no farewell tour, no standing ovation. His exit was quiet, like someone turning off the lights in an empty room, and that's what hurts most. Not the memory loss, not the doctor visits, but the feeling of being forgotten. After everything, the wars, the injuries, the sacrifice, he fades into the background, while the sport he helped shape thrives without him. But some fans do remember. They write to him, they visit, they thank him for being their inspiration, and for a brief moment, he lights up. His eyes regain focus, his voice steadies. "I'm glad I meant something," he says, "even if it cost me everything." That's what legacy really is. Not fame, not fortune, but impact. And Gary's impact is deep, not just in MMA, but in the broader conversation about brain trauma in sports. He's one of the few who spoke up early, one of the few who didn't hide his pain, and one of the few still standing, barely, while others fell silently. So as the sport moves forward, evolving and growing, there's one thing it can't afford to do: forget the men it was built on. The warriors like Gary Goodridge, who paid the highest price without ever asking for applause, who stepped into the ring for the love of the fight and walked out broken, but unbowed. Because when the lights dim and the crowd leaves, all that's left is the man in the mirror. And for Gary, even when he can't recognize the face staring back, he knows he earned every scar.